Well, thanks, Kyle, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My seventh, and I might say final EPO in Brisbane. As I think many people know, I will not be continue on at CEDA beyond the end of the conclusion of my current appointment. I will miss Queensland, I will miss Brisbane, I will miss coming up here talking about the issues that matter to us all as we look to how good public policy can be framed, can be developed, and how the leaders that we elect into the parliaments of Australia, whether they be nationally or at the state level, actually go about enacting good public policy. And we've tried to drive that over the last 7 years, and I think with some degree of success. But if we're going to talk about politics, and some of my colleagues in the room from my organisation feel I'm occasionally, at this stage of my career, likely go a bit rogue when I start talking about this, but I can assure you and them that I'm not. Well, maybe I will, we'll see. But when you start to talk about the political environment that we are seeing at the national level, and indeed here in the Queensland level, you cannot take away a focus on economic questions. And so it's quite important that Michael will be coming up and talking about the nature of the Australian economy, the nature of the Queensland economy, some of the projections that he has as to what's likely to happen. But I think the important thing for us, if we think about politics at the moment, is that there are some outstanding features. Firstly, on the international stage, you cannot divorce what happens in some aspects of Australia's economy and its political environment without some consideration of at the international stage. Two significant events are affecting that already. Brexit, firstly, the vote in the UK about leaving the European Union. The result of that really was more about what drove that. Why did people want to become separate now, a sense of identity perhaps being again driven, or really a feeling of being disaffected because they thought there were too many immigrants coming into the UK, or that they were losing some form of economic benefit themselves. Were they a great power still, and what needed to happen? And so you had politicians promising all sorts of things. We'll wait and see what the outcome of that is. But, of course, that's for the UK to worry about. The other, of course, was the ascendancy of President Trump in the United States. Now, from our perspective, a couple of things about that has become critical. The first is, of course, one of the first things that the President did was to pull the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This, of course, was going to have ramifications for Australia, not as big as some people perhaps have been saying and suggesting. More it was for some of the emerging and developing economies in our region, but there was a security element that was associated with that. And so as a consequence, the TPP is dead, long live the TPP. We've got to work out what does that mean for us in an economic and political sense. From my perspective, it is about re-engaging even more than we currently are with the Asian region. Asia is the fastest growing part of the world economy. There are more millionaires, there are more middle-class people with money in their pockets to spend in the Asia region than the rest of the globe together. And as a consequence, we're on the cusp of that. We've had in the past an engagement strategy with Asia. We've got a whole bunch of bilateral trade agreements with Asian economies, including China. And I think it is time that we dusted some of the perspectives on those off and see what does it actually mean for us. The other thing I would say, and I'm not going to dwell too much on this, is that what I would like to think in the Australian media is that we concentrate in a political sense less on what's happening in the United States. It might be good theatre for some, but let's get back to what really matters for us, and that's Australia. Let's start reporting what's going on in the Australian and the Queensland and the New South Wales parliaments. Let's start thinking about the various policies that are being advocated by the different parties and what the government of the day is seeking to do. Now, 2 weeks ago we had the Prime Minister speak at the National Press Club. He gave a speech where he outlined what his government hoped to achieve during the coming 12 months. What was the headline the next day out of that? Malcolm admits to paying $1.75 million to the Liberal Party to win the election. Okay? Now, who gives a rat's personally? I mean, I don't. Good on him. Okay, he could do that. I wanted to know and I wanted to read, and I wanted the mob out there, all of us, to know what is it that the Prime Minister was saying that they were going to do this year. The next day, Bill Shorten spoke, or it might have been the day before, and Bill Shorten talked about every person who wants to work in Australia under a Labor government will have a job. Well, yeah, that's good. I think everybody wants to do that. But is that the policy prescription? How are you going to do that? Let's have a bit more analysis of what that means. And so, as a recovering politician myself, I think back and say, how is it that we now, as residents of this great country of ours, how is it that we're looking to our political masters and those that are making policies? How are they going to make our lives better? And of course, what we've seen and what CEDA's tried to drive in a number of contributions over the last 6 or 7 years has been a genuine consideration of those policy issues that matter. One of them is captured in our report, and that is the federal government budget deficit. I mean, you may not think it's important to you, but let me tell you, it is. We're running a budget deficit above $40 billion and rising. And every time the government of the day says they will bring a surplus in by a certain year, at the half-yearly review period, they then push it out by another year. And then we start to think about how are you going to do it? And the government talks about expenditure cuts. And then we get down and dirty to start thinking about, well, what does that mean for me? Family tax benefits, that's going to disappear for some of us. The NDIS funding, everybody believes in NDIS, but how are we going to sustain that? The Liberal Party, someone was talking about the fact that they might cap back funding for private schools. There's a whole raft of these things that float around and then miraculously seem to disappear. I was saying a little earlier to Michael Blythe, a couple of years ago, or however long it was when the Prime Minister took over from Tony Abbott, he said the big thing he wanted was that everything was back on the table of consideration around taxation reform, around genuine economic reform that we needed in Australia, fixing up the federation arrangements, etc. It was all on the table. That was a very big table. But I got to tell you, within the space of a little over 6 months, there was very little left on it. It was all swept away. When we started to have a bit of a debate again about taxation, when we talked about the GST, when we talked about capital gains, when we talked about negative gearing in the Australian economy, you had a couple of premiers that were out there as stalking horses for the federal government talking about a genuine debate about lifting and broadening the GST, but at the same time then giving up some of the state taxing powers so that there would be a better distribution. It lasted about 2 weeks, and then because the federal government got spooked, it was swept off the table. That is not economic reform. That is not leadership about what we're looking for at the moment. And why are we needing to do that? Simply because what we are seeing more and more of is the rise of smaller populist groups that are emerging in Australia in a political context that are all slogan and no answers. How many people here, for example, have been on the website and had a look at what the policies are for One Nation? When you get past the fact that climate change is a conspiracy emerging out of, I don't think it's Scientology, but it's out of the United Nations. I mean, that's the level that we get down to. When you go on to some of the websites of people like Cory Bernardi, well, funny thing is, Cory Bernardi was in the Liberal Party until a week ago. And number 2 on the Senate ticket in South Australia decided he didn't like what was going on, so he left. You had an example up here. Clive Palmer had a bunch of senators elected and his good self. And, 6 months later, they decided they didn't like him, so they were going to leave and become independents. And had it not been for a double dissolution election campaign, they would have been there for another 5 years, but people didn't vote for them as independents. They voted for them because they were members of a political party. So there is a bit of an argument I might suggest that Cory should do the honourable things if he believes in this, fall on his sword and let another Liberal come into the Parliament. After all, that's what was elected, but of course that ain't going to happen, and he's out there and he's starting his own party. And just another one of these groups that are here in what I believe is a race to the bottom. It is a race to the bottom to try and say, everybody's disaffected in Australia. Woe is me, I can't get on, I can't make a buck, I can't do this, I can't do that. We're going to blame someone, we're going to blame the government. It's always the government's fault. We don't want to pay tax. Fine, don't want to pay tax. What services don't you want delivered? Give me a list of all those. Don't want to defend Australia? Fine, we won't do that. You know, don't want your garbage collected? Right, we won't pay our rates to the council. This is the nonsense at which we have now emerged in Australia, in my view. We are lacking communicators. We are lacking some degree of leadership in putting ideas out there, being convicted to those ideas, and then arguing the case. You know, look, as I said, I perhaps was a bit, this is a bit rogue, but I was perhaps a bit beneficiary in that I was a member of the Hawke and Keating governments, but I was in opposition under John Howard. And let me tell you, there was leadership with those guys, because they had a cabinet that was behind them, that was united basically, that believed in something. And yet, you know, sadly, where I see some of the problems for us, and I know the government's only got a one-seat majority, and I know they've got a dreadful Senate to deal with, but the trouble is there is a group in our society, and you cannot deny it, that feel they are being disadvantaged. They are not getting the benefits they perceive they should be getting, and they're seeing and they're believing some of the criticism that comes about the way and the nature in which the Australian economy is by necessity changing. We have always been a net importer of capital, for example. So why do we stand in the way of people that want to invest in Australia to create more jobs? We have always been, as an economy that has been welcoming, an economy, a society that has always believed in a fair go. But these days, there's a group in our society that we don't believe need a fair go. And sadly, there's a bit of xenophobia and a touch of racism that's added into that. We need to sink that immediately. We need to get back to what Australia was really founded about. And the political class in Australia are the ones that need to drive that. I mean, I look at a report that was spoken about at our EPO in Melbourne the other day. And it said something like 40% of Australians, particularly in rural and regional Australia, believe that they are being left behind, that nobody really cares for them, that nobody listens to them. Now, I can understand why some of that might be the case. I can understand why that if you happen to live in Birdsville, you want the delivery of services there at the same rate as if you're living in the middle of Brisbane CBD. But, you know, effectively, it may not necessarily be the case. But I also understand that some of these folks, you know, where they're starting to get some fear into their lives is being driven by their concern about the future of work and the fourth industrial revolution. All of the buzzwords around about innovation. When they hear people talking about innovation, they think, oh my God, that means a robot or a computer is going to take my job. Now, let me tell you, we've got to be smart about this. We put a report out 2 years ago and we talked about some of this, but we said you've got to make the computer technology and the robotics of today, you make that your friend. We are still going to need, in Australia's political context and its economic context, 80% of us work in services industries. A lot of those can be delivered through the use of computer technology, but it still takes a person, a body, to do that. So we've got to be smart about the way in which politically we approach some of this stuff, and we've got to put to bed some of this nonsense that's being espoused by people. As I say, all slogan and absolutely no policies or absolutely no idea how to address that. But I do recognise, and I hope the people in the political environment that are running Australia and our states understand that there is a group out there in the community that are worried. But they have to deal with that. They have to deliver them services. They have to do some economic reform that is going to make a real difference to them. But importantly, they have to explain how that will help them out. Now, one of the things, again, that I thought was interesting when we are trying to marry politics and economics together, and Michael talks a little bit about this in a moment, but it's around the fact that we hear so much time and effort invested in saying we need to have our AAA credit rating. You then have the Reserve Bank of Australia come out, and any number of economists who know what they're talking about, saying one of the ways in which we can continue to stimulate economic growth in Australia is to invest in infrastructure. So up here in Queensland, I mean, you're talking about, is it the Cross River Harbour Tunnel or something or other? Maybe not the harbour, but the Cross Rail tunnel, that's Sydney. And at the national level, there's rail proposals that are being talked about, there's improvements to port facilities, but it's also in hospitals. I read a report in the paper this morning from the Australian Medical Association that talked about how poor rates were now of people's access to operations and the waiting times in emergencies and so on. Investing in our infrastructure, in our hospitals, in our schools, in our roads, in our rail networks, in our ports, all of that is going to make a great difference. Well, let me tell you, at interest rates down at 1.5% at the cash rate, AAA credit rating, government can borrow. Some debt is good. Not all debt is good. Some debt is good. And for infrastructure to stimulate the Australian economy, this is one way you could do it. But it takes political leadership and it takes a bit of guts to do it. And the time has come, I think, for those in Canberra, those in Brisbane, those in Sydney to think about this. The other thing I think that what does contribute to this fear at a political level about 40% of Australians thinking they're not really getting a fair go is that people look at Sydney and they look at Melbourne. They see the cranes on the skyline, they see apartment towers being thrown up in Melbourne. Don't ask me why, because no one's buying them, but anyway. Apartment towers being thrown up down there. You see metro rail and roads and the tramway down the middle of George Street that's causing havoc and so on. All of this is happening. But you go outside the boundaries of Sydney and Melbourne, 4,800 people lost their jobs in the car industry, or will do in September of this year, called it off. What does this say? Where are we out there in the regions helping people that need to embrace these changes that are coming? And it comes from strong political will, and it comes from strong economic policy and social policy. Giving a hand to those people who need it, don't give a hand to hold them back. But it does take some courage, and it takes a little bit of something that unfortunately we don't see a lot of these days, and that is a bit more give and take across political boundaries. I know that the government of the day over the last several years has always had to do some horse trading, and that's always been the nature of it. You always do horse trading, there's people in the Senate. But when you get the likes of the Xenothons, or you get the likes of the Jackie Lambys or these other people, fundamentally, and sometimes the genuine opposition, holding the government of the day to ransom in not going forward with those policy prescriptions that are going to give a much better standard of living to all of us, then you have to ask the question, is it any wonder then why a number of people saying, well, there might be something better. There might be something better. It might be that one of these other parties are going to give us something better. But let me tell you, on the evidence to date, I don't think it's right. If you take a look and wrap up my contribution here, if you look at, for example, what's happening where apparently in Queensland the Hanson forces are gathering quite a bit of support, and nationally across Australia I think they're measuring about 8% of the national vote. I mean, every second day they're losing a candidate because this candidate is more outrageous than one before. Now, are you seriously thinking that that's going to solve Queensland's problems or Australia's problems by putting them into the Parliament of Australia or the Parliament of Queensland? I'm sorry, I beg to differ. It just ain't going to happen. And so I think we collectively now, people that are here, you come along, you hear Michael Blythe, you hear Diane, you hear others talk about what the real world is like, the challenges facing businesses, the challenges facing ordinary people who are perhaps on disabilities or whatever, and you think, what is it that needs to change in a changing world that we have? And my view is, again, it is about, from a political perspective, drawing on the benefits that we have as a nation of people that are clever, are willing to have a go, roll the sleeves up. We've got to get back to that, less of the, what we call the middle class welfare, everybody sticking their hand out and saying, that's what I want because I'm owed it. At the end of the day, it is again about Australia championing the things that it's always stood for. And in a political context, it means having people in Canberra or in Brisbane that are out there doing just that for you, making decisions that will result in good economic and social policy that will benefit the greatest number. I'm sorry to tell some people, there will always be losers in decisions that are made. So suck it up. That's the way it is. There will always be losers. You've got to try and minimise who those losers are, and you've got to try and compensate them. That's the political trick. Sadly, I think it's the political trick that our folks, particularly in Canberra, have lost sight of. They have no idea. We need to get that leadership back. We need to get some courage back. We need to get some genuine economic reform on the table, and we need to look after those people less able to look after themselves. That really is where Australia should be going politically, and it's up to every one of you that sit in this room here to go forward as disciples of that sort of message and make sure it is heard. And importantly to our elected representatives, make sure it's heard to them. Lovely to be with you as always. I look forward to coming back and facilitating the discussion after lunch. Thank you.